At 72 years old, memory, to me, is like an old film reel, its frames yellowed and scratched with time. The surface of my life now is as serene as an autumn lake, reflecting my warm home in Harrisburg with my Walter and the laughter of my grandchildren. But with just a passing breeze, the surface ripples, and the shadow of a horrifying past rises from the depths. It's a scar I've carried for over half a century, a silent secret sealed away in the most sacred of places by the man I once respected most. This isn't just a tale, it's a true story of survival, of the cost of silence, and the strength it takes to reclaim one's own voice. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. This story begins in my adolescence, at a time when I couldn't even imagine what was to come. I was born in 1953-inch Harmony Creek, a town so small that everyone knew each other by their first and last names. Our house was 3 blocks from the town square, a simple light blue painted wooden structure, with a large plot of land where my mother, Ruth, grew a little bit of everything. Cassava, sweet potatoes, corn, and an apple tree, which was the joy of the neighborhood kids in the summer. My father, Mr. Arthur Miller, was a carpenter and one of the most respected men in the community. Tall, with an imposing stature, he had severe brown eyes that seemed to see right through you. He always wore well-ironed shirts, even on weekdays. And on Sundays, he would dress in his only suit, a navy blue one that my mother cared for as if it were a sacred relic. In church, he always sat in the front pews, and his deep voice stood out in the hymns, making many people turn to see who was singing with such fervor. We were 5 siblings. I was the middle child, with 2 older, Andrew and Sarah, and 2 younger, Paul and Clara. Andrew followed in my father's footsteps in carpentry. Sarah married early and moved to Pittsburgh. Paul went to the seminary at 14, influenced by the high regard Dad had for the church. And Clara, the youngest, always had fragile health, which made Mom dedicate more time to her. Our routine was simple and regulated by the clock and by faith. We woke up with the first crow of the rooster around 5-inch the morning. Mom was already up, lighting the wood stove to prepare breakfast. A warm coffee cake and milk for us children, and strong black coffee for Dad. After breakfast, Dad would leave for the carpentry shop, which was 2 streets from our house, and we would go to Harmony Creek Elementary. The school was an old 2-story building with a wooden staircase that creaked with every step. I remember the smell of wax on the floor that the janitors applied every Friday, and the blue and white uniform that Mom kept impeccable, even with 5 children to care for. At recess, we played tag, ring around the rosy, or hopscotch, drawn with pieces of broken brick on the dirt playground. After school, we helped Mom at home. The girls learned to cook, sew, and take care of the house, while the boys helped in the garden or accompanied Dad to the carpentry shop some afternoons. It was there, watching Mom sew our uniforms and mend the family's clothes, that I learned my first stitches. She had a black and gold pedal-operated singer, which I now keep as a treasure. Sundays were sacred for 2 things: the 9 a.m. Mass and family lunch. St. Sebastian's Parish, the town's patron saint, was the heart of Harmony Creek. Built at the beginning of the century, it had stained glass windows that cast magical lights on the stone floor when the sun shone through them. The altar was made of carved wood, a work my father helped restore when I was about 6 years old. This brought Dad much closer to Father Thomas, who arrived at the parish around 1959, when I was about 6. Father Thomas was a man of medium height, always impeccably dressed in his black cassock. He had a round, rosy face and wore thick-rimmed glasses that magnified his blue eyes. His voice during sermons was soft but firm, and he had a special way of making everyone feel touched by his words, as if he were speaking directly to each of us. He quickly became beloved by the entire community, and his friendship with my father was a source of pride for our family. "Mr. Arthur is my right-hand man," the priest would say to everyone, a God-fearing man like few others. And Dad returned the admiration, always inviting the priest to have lunch with us on Sundays, at least twice a month. Those were special lunches, where Mom would go all out with roast chicken and mashed potatoes, a regional classic, or on special occasions, a big meal with rice, beans, pasta, stuffing, collard greens, fried bananas, and a fried egg, served mainly on holidays. During these lunches, Father Thomas told stories of his hometown, Hershey in Pennsylvania, and spoke about his plans for the parish. My father listened attentively and would quickly offer to help, whether it was fixing the church pews, redoing the handrail of the choir loft stairs, or organizing the church fairs. And he always took one of us children to help, usually Andrew or Paul. I rarely went, as Dad said that church was no place for a girl to be alone. Ironically, I would later discover the real reason for this apparent care. Life in Harmony Creek in the 52nd and 62nd was marked by the seasons and religious holidays. At the St. Sebastian's Festival in January, the whole town participated in the novenas, processions, and the fair, where stalls sold funnel cake, apple cider, and kettle corn. There was the greased pole, where the young men tried to climb to win the prize tied at the top, and a strongman contest, which attracted farmers from all over the region. At home, we were raised with strict discipline. Dad did not allow tardiness, poorly ironed clothes, or incomplete homework. He used the belt to correct any misbehavior, especially with the boys. With the girls, he used words more, but they were so harsh that sometimes we preferred the belt. A girl must be pure like the Virgin Mary, he always said. Any stain on your reputation never comes out. Until I was 12, I believed my father was the most righteous man in the world. I admired his posture in church, the respect everyone had for him, and how he was never late for anything. Andrew and Sarah sometimes commented that he was too strict, but for me, he was just a father who wanted the best for his children. Mom, always quiet and submissive, never contradicted his decisions, even when her eyes welled up seeing one of her children being punished. It was around that age that I began to notice small changes in my father's behavior. When he came back from the church, after helping with some maintenance, usually late at night, he brought with him a smell of whiskey that he tried to disguise with mints. His eyes looked different. There was something in them that caused me an inexplicable discomfort, and he started to watch me in a strange way, especially when I changed clothes in the room I shared with my sisters and forgot to lock the door. I remember one afternoon shortly before my 13th birthday when I was sewing with Mom on the porch. Dad came home from the carpentry shop earlier than usual and watched us for a while, leaning against the doorframe. Suddenly he said, "Abigail is becoming a young lady, Ruth. It's time for her to learn more about the ways of the Lord." Mom just nodded without looking up from the fabric, but I noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she made the next stitch. That night, I had trouble sleeping. There was something in my father's voice, in the way his eyes followed me for the rest of the day, that left me uneasy. It was as if a cold wind had entered our house, announcing a storm that I couldn't yet see, but could already feel. It was on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks after my 13th birthday, that it all began. I remember it as if it were today. We were having dinner, beans with rice, sautéed collard greens, and a bit of pork left over from Sunday. Dad, who normally spoke little during meals, suddenly announced, "Abigail will start accompanying me on my visits to the church." Mom looked up quickly, a rare thing for her who usually kept her eyes down. "But, Arthur, the girl has school early," she tried to argue in an almost inaudible voice. "Religious education is as important as book learning, Ruth," Dad replied dryly. "Father Thomas and I agree that it's time for her to get to know the services of the Lord's house more deeply." Mom said nothing more, just nodded and looked back at her plate. Sarah, who was still living with us at the time, looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It seemed like concern mixed with a deep sadness. That same night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Dad knocked on the door of the room I shared with my sisters. "Get ready, Abigail. We're going to the church." Confused, I put on a simple dress over my nightgown, combed my hair, and put on my shoes. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, a time when the church would normally be closed. When I questioned Dad about it, he answered with irritation in his voice. "A servant of God can enter the Lord's house at any time, and I have the key that Father Thomas entrusted to me for maintenance." The walk to the church was silent. The streets of Harmony Creek were deserted at that hour, lit only by the few yellow streetlights. The sky was overcast, starless, and a cold wind blew, making the dry leaves dance on the ground. I remember hugging myself, feeling a shiver that wasn't just from the night's cold. The parish church looked different in the darkness. Its spires rose like shadows against the sky, and the stained glass windows, without the sunlight to pass through them, were just dark patches on the walls. Dad unlocked the side door that led to the sacristy, and we entered. The creak of the door echoed through the empty space, making my heart race. Inside the church, only a few votive candles near the altar were lit, creating shadows that danced on the walls. The smell of wax and incense filled the air. Dad lit 2 more candles and placed them on the altar. "Come here, Abigail," he called, his voice sounding strangely loud in the silence of the sacred place. I approached slowly, feeling my knees tremble, without understanding why. There was something in his eyes, something I had never seen before. "Do you know why we are here?" he asked, placing his hands on my shoulders. "To pray, Daddy," I answered uncertainly. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was something different that made my stomach clench. "We are here for you to learn about humility and obedience before God," he said, squeezing my shoulders tighter. "The body is a temple, but also a source of sin. You are growing up, becoming a woman, and you need to learn to purify yourself." Confused and scared, I remained silent, not understanding what he meant. It was then that Dad took a step back and said the words that would mark the beginning of my nightmare. "Take off your dress, Abigail." "What, Daddy?" I asked, thinking I had misheard. "Take off the dress. Here, in God's house, you will learn to be ashamed of your sinful body." My dears, I know what you must be thinking. How could a father say such a thing? Even now, after all these years, I still struggle to understand what kind of darkness had taken hold of his heart. To be able to warp the word of God into such a cruel weapon. My eyes filled with tears as I stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. "But, Daddy, why? Don't question." He raised his voice, making it echo off the church walls. "Eve questioned God and brought sin into the world. You will learn to obey without questioning." With trembling hands and silent tears streaming down my face, I began to unbutton the simple blue cotton dress. Shame burned my face as I stood in just my slip in front of the altar. My father's gaze swept over me from head to toe, making me feel dirty in a way I had never felt before. "Now, kneel and pray," he ordered, pointing to the altar. "Pray that God forgives the vanity and lust that are beginning to grow in you." I knelt on the cold stone floor, shivering from cold and fear. The tears blurred my vision as I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could God want this? How could my father, the man everyone respected, put me through such humiliation? While I was kneeling, I heard a subtle noise coming from the sacristy, a movement, a stifled sigh, something that made me turn my head quickly. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving as if someone was watching, but the sacristy was too dark to be sure. "Don't get distracted." Dad's voice cut through my thoughts. "You are before God." We stayed like that for almost an hour, me kneeling, praying between silent sobs, and my father standing, watching me with that look I had never seen before. When he finally allowed me to put my dress back on, my legs were numb and my knees ached from the prolonged contact with the stone floor. On the way back home, Dad spoke only once. "This will happen every week. It's for your own good, for your purification, and don't you dare tell anyone, especially not your mother. This is between you, me, and God." That night I couldn't sleep. Lying in the bed I shared with Clara, I stared at the wooden ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. Beside me, my younger sister slept peacefully, unaware of the horror I had just experienced. Lying there, my dears, it felt like I'd been hollowed out. The world was still the same wooden ceiling, the same sleeping sister, but deep in my soul, I knew that nothing could ever be as it was. I had crossed a line I never even knew existed. And just like that, my dears, a child's world can shatter overnight. Abigail's innocence, like a clear mirror, was broken by the very father she respected most. But the horror wasn't over, because the darkness in that church held an even more terrifying secret. I wanted to tell someone, to ask for help. But who? Mom lived under Dad's thumb as much as we children did. My older siblings no longer lived at home. And in small Harmony Creek, the word of Mr. Arthur Miller was worth more than anyone else's, especially that of a 3-year-old girl. The following week it happened again, and the next as well. Each visit to the church became more difficult than the last. Dad started demanding that I take off my slip too, leaving me in just my underwear. "Shame purifies the soul," he would say, as he watched me kneeling, exposed and humiliated. It was on the third visit that I was sure we were not alone. While I was praying, staring intently at the crucifix on the altar to avoid my father's gaze, I heard that subtle noise from the sacristy again. This time, when I turned my head quickly, I could see clearly. The sacristy door was ajar, and through the crack, a pair of eyes was watching us. They were the blue eyes magnified by the thick-rimmed glasses of Father Thomas. My blood ran cold. You see, my dears, that was the moment my world truly shattered. It wasn't just my father anymore. It was the church itself, the very place we were taught to seek refuge that had turned its back on me. How could a child stand against the two people she believed represented God when they had joined together to break her? Can you even imagine? The most sacred of places had become the stage for the cruelest of conspiracies. Now, it wasn't just Mr. Arthur, but Father Thomas, God's representative, who had also turned his back on her. When the two most powerful men in a child's life join forces against her, hope can seem completely lost. But would Abigail submit forever? Or would a spark of light find its way through this overwhelming despair? Let's find out. The priest, the man who was supposed to be God's representative on earth, was there, hidden, watching my humiliation. It wasn't just my father. It was both of them, united in a perverse pact that desecrated the very place they were supposed to protect. When our eyes met, he quickly retreated into the shadows. But I knew what I had seen, and that certainty hit me like a punch to the stomach. The two highest authority figures in my life, my father and the priest, were betraying me in the cruelest way possible. "Daddy," I whispered, still looking at the sacristy door. "Is someone there?" My father followed my gaze and, to my surprise, he smiled. It wasn't a smile of shame or guilt, but of satisfaction. "It's just Father Thomas," he replied casually. "He is praying for your soul." At that moment, I understood the extent of the horror. It wasn't a secret my father was keeping from the priest. It was a secret they shared. A silent agreement, where my father exercised power over me, and the priest watched, hidden in the shadows of the sacristy. The nightly visits to the church continued for weeks, then months, always the same ritual. Me, forced to be naked, kneeling in forced prayer, my father watching openly, and the priest, hidden but ever present. With each visit, I felt a part of me dying, the faith I once had shattering like the shards of a broken stained glass window. At school, my performance began to drop. I couldn't concentrate. I slept during classes after sleepless nights. The teachers noticed the change, but attributed it to teenage fatigue or a difficult phase. At home, I became quiet and withdrawn. I avoided being alone with my father and flinched whenever he came near. Mom noticed the change in my behavior. One afternoon, as we were washing clothes together in the backyard washtub, she touched my arm gently. "Is something wrong, my daughter?" she asked, her eyes revealing genuine concern. I wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the weight of that horrible secret. But just as I opened my mouth to speak, I saw Dad standing in the back door, watching us with those eyes that now caused me so much terror. The message was clear. He was always watching, always ready to ensure my silence. "It's nothing, Mom," I replied, lowering my gaze to the soapy clothes. "I just haven't been sleeping well." At night, lying in bed, I started planning an escape. Maybe I could go to Pittsburgh, find my sister Sarah, or maybe to Philadelphia, where a cousin of Mom's lived. But how could a 13, then 14, then 5-year-old girl travel alone? Where would I get money for the ticket? And even if I managed to run away, Mr. Arthur's word would arrive before me, painting me as an ungrateful and lying daughter. It was when I turned 16 that things got even worse. During one of the nightly visits to the church, Father Thomas was no longer content to watch from the shadows. He came out of the sacristy and stood at the altar, next to my father. "Abigail is becoming a woman," he said to my father, not even looking at me, as if I were an object being evaluated. "The humiliation is working. She is learning the necessary submission." My father nodded proudly, as if they were discussing the progress of a carpentry project and not the systematic destruction of my dignity and faith. It was on that night that, for the first time, the priest also gave me direct orders, telling me to get into different positions for the better contemplation of sin. The horror now had two faces, two voices, two pairs of eyes watching me. The place that should have been sacred, the church where I was baptized and had my first communion, had become my personal torture chamber. And the two people who should have protected me, my father by blood, the priest by duty of his office, were my tormentors. I started to get sick frequently. Unexplained fevers, stomach pains, nightmares that made me wake up screaming in the middle of the night. My body was manifesting what my voice could not express. Mom took me to a doctor in Lancaster, a larger city near Harmony Creek, but the tests showed nothing physical. "It's nerves," the doctor said, prescribing a mild sedative. The nerves, of course, had a first and last name. They had the face of my father and Father Thomas. They had the echo of their footsteps in the empty church at night. They had the cold of the stone floor on my bruised knees. One night, after another session of humiliation in the church, I made a desperate decision. I couldn't go on living like this. If I couldn't run away, if I couldn't speak, maybe I could end it all another way. The next day, I took a few pills from the sedative the doctor had prescribed and hid them under my mattress. Each day I saved one or two, accumulating enough for what I planned to do. But fate, or perhaps the real God, not the one my father and the priest distorted, had other plans for me. The morning after the day I decided I would take all the pills at once, the announcement that would change everything arrived in Harmony Creek. The bishop of the diocese, Bishop Raymond, would be visiting the parish for a special confirmation mass. The announcement of the bishop's visit ignited a small flame of hope in me. Bishop Raymond was known throughout the region as a just and strict man who did not tolerate misconduct in the clergy. His visits to parishes were rare and always caused a stir. It was as if a general was coming to inspect the troops. Father Thomas, normally so self-assured, seemed nervous in the masses that followed the announcement. "The bishop will arrive in 3 weeks," he informed one Sunday, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "We need to prepare everything to receive him with the dignity he deserves." I watched as my father and the priest exchanged tense glances after the announcement. Something about the authority Bishop Raymond represented worried them, and that worry ignited the first spark of a plan in me. Meanwhile, the nightly visits to the church continued, now with renewed cruelty, as if the two men sensed that their power over me was somehow threatened. On one of those nights, when autumn had already chilled the air of Harmony Creek, something inside me broke completely. "Tonight, you're going to be completely bare," my father ordered, his voice carrying that tone I had learned to fear. "No, Daddy, please," I begged, hugging my own body as if I could protect myself. "It's too cold," and this is I didn't finish the sentence. The slap came fast and hard, hitting my face with such force that I staggered backward, nearly falling. "You dare to disobey?" he roared, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave marks. "Who do you think you are to question?" Father Thomas, who was watching from the shadows, stepped forward. His normally rosy face was pale, but his eyes shone with a disturbing intensity. "Arthur," he said, his voice falsely smooth, "remember, we are in the house of God. Physical violence is not necessary. The girl will learn." He turned to me and, for the first time, addressed me directly with that tone he used in Sunday sermons, but now distorted by something terrible. "Abigail, disobedience is the worst of sins. That is how Eve fell, and that is how all women fall. Do you want to fall into sin?" Trembling uncontrollably from both cold and fear, I shook my head no. "Then prove your obedience," he continued, looking at my clothes. "Prove that you want to be saved." With tears streaming down my face and a lump in my throat that barely let me breathe, I began to take off my clothes, piece by piece. First the dress, then the slip, finally my underwear, until I was completely exposed under the gaze of the two men. The cold of the church penetrated my skin, but it was the inner cold that consumed me, a frozen emptiness where innocence and faith once were. "Now kneel and pray," my father ordered, his voice low and hoarse. I knelt on the stone floor, my knees already calloused from so many similar nights. I closed my eyes tightly, not wanting to see the gazes that roamed my body, and began to murmur automatic prayers, empty words that no longer had meaning for me. At that moment, I heard Father Thomas approach. He stopped right in front of me and said, "Open your eyes, Abigail. Look at the crucifix while you pray." I reluctantly opened my eyes, only to find that he had positioned himself in such a way that I had to look at him and not the altar as I prayed. His face was just inches from mine, and there was something in his eyes that made me want to scream, but no sound came from my throat. "Do you understand what we are doing here? Don't you?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. "We are saving your soul. The body is just sinful flesh. It must be humiliated for the soul to rise." As he spoke, I realized my father had moved away, heading towards the main door of the church. I heard the click of the lock. He was locking us inside the temple. "Your father has given me permission to intensify your purification," the priest continued, now placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "From today on, we will deepen your learning." The terror I felt at that moment is something I cannot fully describe. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the church, as if the very walls were about to collapse on me. For a moment, I considered running, screaming, fighting, but where to? To whom? Who would believe my word against that of the esteemed Father Thomas and the respected Mr. Arthur? What happened next remains in my memory as fragmented flashes, distorted images that my mind tried to block to protect me. Sometimes the pain is too much to bear, and the mind must protect itself by burying the worst memories. Poor Abigail was pushed to the absolute brink. It's in these darkest of moments that a person often faces a choice, to break completely or to find a strength they never knew they had. What will happen to our girl? I remember the priest's hands, cold as a corpse's, touching me with a feigned solemnity, as if performing some profane ritual. I remember his murmured prayers as he committed those atrocities, using God's name to justify the unjustifiable. I remember my father returning later, watching with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something I would only recognize many years later as guilt. I remember returning home that night, feeling completely empty, as if there was nothing left inside me but a great black hole that consumed everything: hope, faith, dignity. In the days that followed, I couldn't look my mother in the eyes. How could I? What words could express the horror I was living? And even if I found the words, what guarantee did I have that I would be believed? In Harmony Creek, the word of a teenager was worth nothing against that of a respected family man and a priest beloved by all. My health deteriorated drastically. I stopped eating, losing so much weight that my clothes hung on my body like on a hanger. At night, the nightmares were so intense that I would wake up screaming, frightening Clara, who began to ask to sleep in Mom's room. During the day, I wandered like a ghost through the house and school, present only in body, my mind always distant, seeking an escape that didn't exist. It was Mrs. Peterson, my English teacher, who first noticed the seriousness of the situation. One day, after class, she called me over to talk. "Abigail, what's happening to you?" she asked, her kind eyes showing genuine concern. I wanted to tell her, to pour out all the poison that was corroding me inside, but the words got stuck in my throat. Years of forced silence and fear had taught me to distrust even kindness. "I'm just tired, teacher," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "Abigail," she insisted, placing a hand on my shoulder, which made me instinctively recoil. "Whatever is happening, you can tell me. I'm here to help." Those simple words, that sincere offer of help, almost broke my resolve of silence. Almost. But then I remembered what had happened the night before in the church, and fear was stronger. "Thank you, teacher," I murmured before quickly leaving the room, leaving Mrs. Peterson with an expression of helplessness that added to my own pain. The visits to the church continued, now with increasing cruelty. The priest, having crossed all sacred boundaries, seemed increasingly bold in his purifications. My father, at times, seemed uncomfortable with Father Thomas's excesses, but never enough to break the diabolical pact they had established. One night, as I was getting dressed after another session of horror, I heard the two of them talking in low voices near the altar. "I'm worried about the bishop's visit," the priest was saying. "Bishop Raymond has a reputation for being very strict. If he finds out, no one will find out anything," my father replied firmly. "Who would believe her word against ours? We are respected men in the community." "Even so," the priest insisted, "we need to be more careful in the coming weeks. No visible marks, and maybe it's better to suspend our sessions until the bishop leaves." My father seemed to consider it for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. Let's take a break. The girl isn't going anywhere. We can resume later." That overheard conversation planted the seed of my plan. They were afraid of the bishop. There was someone whose authority they feared, and this was my chance, perhaps the only one I would have. The following week, as they had agreed, there was no nightly visit to the church. It was the first breath of air I'd had in years. I used every minute of that temporary truce to plan, to gather courage. I couldn't speak directly to the bishop. I knew I would be stopped. But maybe I could write, leave a note, something that would reach his hands without my father or the priest knowing. I started writing a letter, hidden under the covers late at night, using the dim light coming through the window. At first, the words wouldn't come. How to describe the indescribable? How to put the horrors I had lived through on paper without dying of shame? But slowly, like a trickle of water breaking a dam, the words began to flow. "Your Excellency, Bishop Raymond," I wrote with trembling hands. "My name is Abigail Rose Miller. I am 17 years old, and I am the daughter of Arthur Miller. What I am about to tell you is difficult, but it is the truth before God." I described everything, sparing no detail. The nightly visits to the church, the humiliation, the abuse, the pact between my father and the priest. Every word I wrote was like pulling a thorn from my soul, painful, but necessary for healing. I ended the letter begging for help, for intervention, for justice. "I know I may not be believed," I concluded, "but I ask that you, as God's representative, investigate. Observe how Father Thomas acts around young girls. Ask the other young women of the parish if he has ever invited them for private conversations in the sacristy. The truth will come out." I folded the letter several times and hid it inside the lining of my Sunday dress, the one I would wear for the special Mass with the bishop. Now I just needed to wait and pray, no longer to the distorted God of my father and the priest, but to a God of justice that I hoped still existed somewhere. The wait was agonizing. Each day seemed to drag on. Each night brought the fear that my father would change his mind and resume the church visits before the bishop's arrival. My mother, noticing my growing agitation, tried to calm me in her silent way, preparing my favorite dishes, arranging my hair with special care, small gestures that said what she couldn't express in words. One afternoon, while helping Mom hang laundry on the clothesline in the backyard, she came closer than usual and whispered, so low I almost didn't hear, "Whatever you're planning, be careful." My daughter. I looked at her, surprised, seeing in her eyes a knowledge she had never admitted. Did she know? Had she always known? And was she, like me, trapped in a web of fear and silence? "Mom," I began, but she shook her head slightly, indicating we shouldn't talk there. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen preparing dinner, she continued in a low voice, "Your father. He is not the man everyone thinks he is," she whispered, her hands stilling in the dough. She finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw not just submission in her eyes, but a deep, ancient fear. "There's a darkness in him, Abigail. I've seen it for years. I saw how he looked at you. I saw the changes in you. Every night you went to that church, a piece of me died because I was too afraid to stop him. He made me afraid of my own shadow." Her voice broke. "I have failed you as a mother. I cannot undo my cowardice, but I swear on my life, I will not let you stand alone anymore. Whatever you do, I am with you." Oh, my dears, it's so easy to judge from the outside, isn't it? For so many years, a part of me was angry with my mother, But looking back now, with a mother's eyes, I don't see a coward anymore. I see another victim. Fear is its own kind of cage, and my father had locked my mother in it long before he ever locked me. The silence was finally broken, not with a shout, but with a pained whisper. Mrs. Miller's confession was not just a release for herself, but it lit a torch of hope for Abigail. She was no longer fighting completely alone, and one ally, however late, can change everything. Would Abigail's plan have a better chance of success now that she had her mother's silent support? Those words, that small confession, were like a balm to my wounded soul. I wasn't completely alone. My mother, in her own way, limited by the circumstances of her own life, was with me. On the eve of the bishop's arrival, I couldn't sleep. I spent the night mentally reviewing every detail of the plan. The letter was safe, hidden where no one would find it before the right time. All I needed to do was get close enough to the bishop during Mass to hand it directly to him. But what if I couldn't? What if my father or the priest realized what I was doing? Fear consumed me, bringing with it waves of nausea that made me run to the bathroom several times during the night. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted but determined. Today would be the day the silence ended. The news of Bishop Raymond's arrival spread quickly through the small town of Harmony Creek. Around 10 the morning, a shiny black car, very different from the simple vehicles in town, parked in front of the rectory. The bishop had arrived. From our house, I could see the activity in the town square. People gathered to welcome the important visitor, wearing their best clothes, even though it wasn't a Sunday. Father Thomas, his face red and sweaty, looked nervous as he received his superior. Bishop Raymond was a tall, thin man with completely white hair and a face marked by deep wrinkles that gave him an air of severe wisdom. He wore the full vestments of his position, which made him even more imposing. Beside him, Father Thomas seemed diminished, almost insignificant. The special Mass would be held at 5 the afternoon. Throughout the day, the excitement in the town grew. The women prepared treats for the reception that would follow the celebration. The men helped decorate the church with flowers and ribbons. It was as if an extraordinary event was about to happen. And indeed, it was, though not in the way everyone imagined. When it was time to get ready for Mass, I felt my stomach twist into knots. I put on my Sunday dress carefully, making sure the letter was still secure in its hiding place. I combed my hair, tied it with ribbons, trying to look as normal as possible, although my heart was beating so hard it felt like everyone could hear it. "Are you okay?" Clara asked, noticing my paleness. "You look sick." "I'm fine," I answered automatically, the same answer I had been giving for years, even when I was shattered inside. My father entered the room without knocking, as usual. "Are you ready?" he asked, his tone impatient. "I don't want to be late for the bishop's Mass." There was something in his eyes, a restlessness I recognized immediately. Despite his words to the priest, he was considering resuming the nightly visits to the church. The truce was nearing its end. It was now or never. St. Sebastian's parish had never been so crowded. People from all over Harmony Creek and even neighboring towns came for the special Mass presided over by Bishop Raymond. The air was thick with anticipation, the buzz of conversations filling the normally silent space. Our family arrived 20 minutes before the celebration began. My father insisted on sitting in the front row. "We are important members of this community," he would always say whenever someone questioned his insistence on being so far forward. Today, that proximity would serve my purpose. Sitting between my mother and my sister Clara, I trembled so much that I had to clasp my hands in my lap to hide it. The letter seemed to burn inside the lining of my dress, a secret about to explode. I looked around, trying to seem casual, searching for the best moment to approach the bishop. Father Thomas circulated through the church, visibly nervous, adjusting flower arrangements, making sure everything was perfect to impress his superior. When he passed our pew, he gave me a quick, significant look, a silent reminder of the power he held over me, a veiled threat to keep my silence. Beside him, walking with the solemnity of his position, was Bishop Raymond, greeting the faithful with a nod of his head. Up close, he seemed even more imposing. He had sharp eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances and a stern expression that inspired more respect than affection. "That's the bishop," whispered Clara beside me, impressed by the elaborate vestments. "Yes," my father replied, leaning forward. "And after Mass, I will be introduced to him. Father Thomas will make sure to mention all the work I've done for the parish." His tone was one of pride, as if he were about to receive a medal for good service, not like someone who should fear judgment for his actions. That arrogance, that certainty of impunity, was the last straw. At that moment, any hesitation I might have had vanished. He needed to be stopped. They both needed to be, and I would be the instrument of that justice. The Mass began promptly at 5 o'clock. The hymns filled the church, the voices united in praises that once meant so much to me, but now sounded empty after everything I had lived through within those walls. I watched Bishop Raymond preside over the celebration, his voice strong and clear, echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Beside him, Father Thomas looked like a boy caught in mischief, always glancing sideways at his superior, as if fearing to be discovered at any moment. During the sermon, Bishop Raymond spoke about integrity, about how God's representatives on earth should be immaculate examples of virtue. "Hypocrisy is one of the worst sins," he declared, his voice thundering through the church. "Those who use the cloak of faith to hide impure actions will be judged more severely, for they betray not only men, but God himself." I saw Father Thomas swallow hard, his normally rosy face now pale as wax. Beside me, my father shifted uncomfortably in the pew. Were they feeling the weight of their consciences, or just fearing that their secrets might come to light? The time for communion arrived, the moment I had been waiting for. As the faithful formed a line to receive the host, my trembling hand found the hidden letter. With a discreet movement, I removed it from its hiding place and held it firmly. Our row stood up to join the line. My father went first, followed by Mom, then me, and Clara last. The walk to the altar had never seemed so long. Each step was a conscious effort not to crumble under the weight of that decision. In front of me, Mom looked back briefly, and our eyes met. Something in her eyes told me she knew, that she could somehow feel what was about to happen. When my father knelt before the bishop to receive communion, I could see how he lowered his head in a display of false piety that turned my stomach. Then it was Mom's turn, who received the host with a silent reverence. Then it was my turn. I knelt before Bishop Raymond, looking directly into his eyes. Something in my gaze must have communicated the urgency, the desperation, because he held his gaze on mine for a moment longer than usual. "The body of Christ," he said, extending the host. "Amen," I replied. Receiving the host with my left hand, while with my right, in a quick but precise movement, I slipped the folded letter into the sleeve of his vestment. I saw his eyes widen slightly in surprise, but he made no move to stop or reveal my gesture. I stood up quickly and returned to the pew, my heart pounding so hard I feared everyone could hear it. Back in my seat, I couldn't pray. I just fixed my gaze on the altar, watching Bishop Raymond continue to distribute communion. At one point, I saw his free hand discreetly touch the sleeve where I had placed the letter, as if to confirm that something was really there. In that small moment, my dears, my entire future was hanging by a thread. It was both the most terrifying and the most hopeful moment of my life. One small, folded piece of paper against the power of two respected men. It felt like David's little stone, you know? All I could do was pray it would find its mark. One small act, one fragile piece of paper, yet it carried the weight of years of shame and the future of a lifetime. It was all Abigail could do, a final gamble staked on courage and chance. Would the letter reach the right hands? Or would it be discovered, extinguishing her only spark of hope? The next few moments will be incredibly tense, so please, stay with us. Beside me, my father seemed at peace, absorbed in his prayers, completely oblivious to what I had just done. The rest of the Mass passed in a blur. My hands were cold, my mouth was dry, my mind alternating between the terror of what could happen if my plan went wrong and the desperate hope that someone would finally listen to me. After the final blessing, Bishop Raymond announced that he would receive greetings from the faithful at the rectory, where a small reception would also be served. My father, eager to impress the bishop, insisted that the whole family go. "It's an honor to be received by the bishop," he declared, adjusting his tie as we left the church. At the rectory, the tension inside me grew with each minute. The place was crowded, people flocking to speak with Bishop Raymond, who received everyone with a restrained but polite smile. I watched him from a distance, noticing how at one point he discreetly stepped into a side room. Minutes later, he returned with a different expression, more serious, more focused. His eyes scanned the room until they found mine. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I felt that he had read my letter. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know if it was from fear or relief. "Father Thomas," Bishop Raymond's voice cut through the room's buzz like a knife. "I need to speak with you privately, now." The tone brooked no refusal. Father Thomas, who was chatting animatedly with some influential members of the community, stopped mid-sentence. His face, already naturally flushed, turned an almost purple shade. "Of course, Your Excellency," he replied, trying to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. The two retreated to the rectory office, leaving behind a momentary silence followed by a murmur of curiosity. What could be so urgent? Why did the bishop look so serious? My father, who was watching the scene closely, frowned. Something in his instinct must have sounded an alarm, because he started looking around, as if searching for something or someone out of place. His eyes eventually landed on me, and in that instant, I knew he suspected. "What did you do?" he hissed, approaching quickly and grabbing my arm hard enough to leave marks. "What did you tell them?" Before I could answer, the office door opened again. Bishop Raymond reappeared, his face a mask of gravity. Beside him, Father Thomas looked as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, pale, trembling, defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bishop Raymond announced, his voice firm and authoritative, instantly silencing the hall. "I ask you all to leave, except for the Miller family. I have an urgent matter to discuss with Mr. Arthur and his family." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt that something extraordinary was about to occur. Reluctantly, the guests began to leave, casting curious glances in our direction. When the last guest left and the door closed, it was just us, my family, the bishop, and a visibly distraught Father Thomas. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. "Mr. Arthur," Bishop Raymond began, his voice now icy, "I have received very serious information today about your conduct and that of Father Thomas, which, if true, constitute not only a mortal sin but also a crime under the laws of men." My father paled, but quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what Your Excellency is talking about," he replied with forced confidence. Bishop Raymond pulled my letter from the pocket of his vestment and held it up. "This letter, written by your daughter Abigail, contains accusations of such a grave nature that they have left me deeply disturbed. Father Thomas has already partially confessed his participation in the acts described here." The bishop's gaze, sharp and assessing, moved from the priest back to the letter in his hand. "This letter also mentions a teacher, a Mrs. Peterson, who showed you kindness and concern. Is she still in this town?" he asked, looking directly at me. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He turned to one of the aides who had remained by the door. "Find this woman. Bring her here immediately. Tell her the bishop requires her presence on a matter of utmost urgency." All eyes turned to me. My father's was one of pure hatred. Mom's was of pain mixed with a strange relief. Clara's was of confusion and fear. Father Thomas's was the hardest to decipher, a mixture of shame, anger, and something that almost looked like relief. "She's lying," my father exploded, taking a step toward me, his fists clenched. "She's a rebellious girl who has always caused trouble. She made up this story to harm us." Bishop Raymond stepped between us, his tall, imposing figure like a barrier. "Do not approach her," he commanded with an authority that made my father retreat. "Father Thomas has already admitted that you took the girl to the church at night. He said it was for special prayers, but his hesitation and his behavior tell me otherwise." My father looked at the priest in disbelief, as if betrayed. "You told him? You broke our agreement?" Those words were his condemnation. The involuntary confession hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. "So it's true," Bishop Raymond said, his voice now trembling with indignation. "You really?" He couldn't finish the sentence, as if the words were too horrible to be spoken. It was at that moment that something inside me completely broke. Years of forced silence, of humiliation, of suppressed pain, it all exploded in a cry that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. "It's true. It's all true," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. They took me to the church at night. Dad made me take everything off in front of the altar. He said it was to purify me. And the priest would hide, watching everything. Then he started to participate too. I couldn't go on. Sobs racked my body with such force that I could barely stand. Mom rushed to me, wrapping me in her thin but surprisingly strong arms. My daughter, she repeated, crying too. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help?" "He said he would kill you if I told," I answered between sobs. "He said no one would believe me, that everyone would think I was a liar, a sinner." Bishop Raymond watched the scene with a mixture of horror and compassion. A few minutes later, the door opened and the bishop's aide returned, followed by Mrs. Peterson. She looked bewildered, then her eyes found me, then my mother, and finally the grim faces of the bishop and Father Thomas. Her expression shifted to one of dawning horror and understanding. "And I believe her too," she said, her voice trembling but firm as she stepped into the room, her eyes locked with the bishop's. "I am her English teacher. I've seen her go from a bright, engaged student to a ghost. I've seen the bruises on her arms she tried to hide with long sleeves, even on hot days. I asked her about them once, and the terror in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a clumsy teenager. It was the look of a trapped animal. Now I understand why." Her presence, requested by the bishop himself, was another pillar of truth against the wall of silence that had imprisoned me for so long. Bishop Raymond turned to my father and the priest, his face hardened again. "Mr. Arthur Miller, from this moment on, you are forbidden from entering any church in this diocese. As for you, Father Thomas, you are suspended from all your priestly duties until further notice. Tomorrow I will report this case to the civil authorities. What you have done is not just a mortal sin, it is a crime that must be punished by the laws of men." My father, seeing his world crumble, made one last desperate effort. "You're going to believe the word of a disturbed girl against mine? Against a priest's? No one in town will believe this. No one." "I believe her," said my mother, her voice surprisingly firm. "I always knew something was wrong. Her nightmares, the fear, the changes. How could I have been so cowardly? How could I not see what was right in front of my eyes?" A few minutes later, the door opened and the bishop's aide returned, followed by Mrs. Peterson. She looked bewildered. Then her eyes found me, then my mother, and finally the grim faces of the bishop and Father Thomas. Her expression shifted to one of dawning horror and understanding. "And I believe her too," she said, her voice trembling but firm as she stepped into the room. "I've noticed the changes in Abigail for months. I tried to talk to her, but there was always a barrier of fear. Now I understand why." Her presence, requested by the bishop himself, was another pillar of truth against the wall of silence that had imprisoned me for so long. My father, seeing himself cornered, resorted to the last weapon he had always used so well: violence. With a roar of fury, he lunged toward me, fists raised, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You'll regret this, you ungrateful girl. I'll teach you to keep your mouth shut." It all happened so fast. Bishop Raymond tried to intercept him but wasn't quick enough. My mother threw herself in front of me, trying to protect me. My father's fist struck her face with a horrible sound I will never forget. She fell, blood streaming from her nose. That scene, my mother fallen, blood-staining her best dress, finally defending me at the cost of her own safety, was the final straw. Something inside me, which had been silenced by years of abuse, finally found its voice. "Enough," I screamed with a force I didn't know I possessed. "It's over, Dad. Your power over me, over Mom, over all of us, is over. You are not the good man everyone thinks you are. You are a monster, and now everyone will know." My scream seemed to paralyze him. He looked around wildly at the bishop's stony face, at the priest's utter defeat, at my mother's bloody nose, at my defiant stare. For a fleeting second, the mask of the respected Mr. Arthur Miller fell away completely, revealing the pathetic, cornered bully beneath. There was no authority left for him to hide behind. His empire of respect and admiration, built on lies, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. He didn't even look at me again. With a guttural sound of pure animal panic, he turned and ran for the door, disappearing into the night. When that door slammed shut, the room just fell silent. There was no joy, no celebration, just a profound, overwhelming emptiness. It was the first breath, my dears. The first real breath after years of being held under the cold water of fear. That slamming door closed a dark chapter, but it didn't bring the joy of victory, only a profound emptiness. The monster had been driven out, but the wounds he left behind remained. The battle for the truth was over, but a new battle, the battle for healing and rebuilding a life, was just beginning for Abigail and her mother. How would they face it? That night marked the end of my nightmare and the beginning of a new battle. The battle for truth, for justice, and for my own recovery. But for the first time in years, as I helped my mother up, as I received the support of Mrs. Peterson and the protection of Bishop Raymond, I felt something I had forgotten. Hope. The small seed of courage I planted by writing that letter had finally germinated, breaking through the hard soil of fear and silence. And although the road ahead was uncertain and certainly difficult, I was no longer alone. The truth, however painful, had finally come to light. The days following the confrontation at the rectory were a whirlwind. My father had disappeared on the night of the revelation, fleeing like the coward he was beneath that facade of a respectable man. Father Thomas was immediately removed from his duties and taken by Bishop Raymond to the diocesan headquarters in Philadelphia, where he would remain until the ecclesiastical and civil authorities decided his fate. For my mother and me, a difficult but liberating journey began. At dawn the next day, we were still at the rectory, where we had spent the night under Bishop Raymond's protection. My mother's face was swollen from the blow she had received, but there was a determination in her eyes I had never seen before. "We can't go back to that house," she said, holding my hands in hers. "Not after everything that happened there." "But where will we go, Mom?" I asked, feeling the weight of uncertainty upon us. It was Mrs. Peterson who offered us our first shelter. "Come to my house," she said firmly. "I have a spare room, and you can stay as long as you need." That teacher, whom I had always admired for her intelligence and kindness, became the first person to extend a hand when we needed it most. Her small apartment above the central pharmacy in Harmony Creek became our temporary refuge, but the situation was complex. While we were moving into Mrs. Peterson's house, the news of the scandal spread through the small town of Harmony Creek like wildfire. Within hours, the whole town knew that Mr. Arthur Miller and Father Thomas had been accused of terrible acts against me. The reactions were mixed. Some people, especially the women of the town, came to offer us discreet support. Others, incredulous, looked at us with suspicion in the streets. How can a girl make such accusations against such respectable men? I heard someone mutter at the market. The worst came when Clara came home from school crying because the other children were calling her the liar's sister. Paul, my brother who was in the seminary, sent a cold letter saying he couldn't believe I had defamed a man of God and that he was praying for my soul. Only Andrew, my older brother, and Sarah, my sister who lived in Pittsburgh, offered unrestricted support when they heard what had happened. Sarah, in fact, came to visit us as soon as she found out, bringing with her not only emotional comfort but also a proposal. "You can't stay here," she said, sitting in Mrs. Peterson's small living room. "People will always look at you as the ones from the church scandal. Come to Pittsburgh with me. It's a big city. No one knows you there. You can start over." The idea of starting over in a place where no one knew us was tempting, but also frightening. How could we leave behind everything we knew? How could we rebuild our lives from scratch? The decision was made by circumstances beyond our control. 3 weeks after the confrontation, a court officer knocked on Mrs. Peterson's door with a paper in his hands. It was a subpoena. My mother and I were to appear at the courthouse in Lancaster to testify in the case against my father and Father Thomas. Lancaster was almost 3 hours from Harmony Creek, and the courthouse was an imposing building that intimidated me as soon as I saw it. Inside, in a cold, austere room, I gave my testimony before a judge with a severe expression but compassionate eyes. For hours, I had to relive every detail of that nightmare while a clerk typed on a typewriter, recording my suffering in black letters on white paper. My mother also testified, telling how she had always suspected something was wrong, but how fear and years of submission had prevented her from acting. Her testimony, though painful for her, was crucial in corroborating my story. At the end of the hearing, the judge informed us that an arrest warrant had been issued for my father, but he had not yet been located. As for Father Thomas, he was in the custody of the church, awaiting trial by the tribunal, and would also face criminal charges when the case proceeded. What about us? My mother asked the prosecutor, a young man with a compassionate look. Can we go back to our house? Technically, yes, he replied, but I recommend caution. Not everyone in town believes your version of events. It could be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable was an understatement. When we returned to Harmony Creek that night, we found our house with broken windows and horrible words painted on the facade. Someone had tried to set the porch on fire, but the neighbors had managed to put it out before it spread. That was the last straw. That same night, sitting around Mrs. Peterson's table, we made the decision. We would go to Pittsburgh with Sarah. I have a small but cozy apartment, my sister said. There's enough space for the 3 of us, and I know a textile mill that's hiring. Mom could work there, and you, Abigail, could finish your studies at a different school where no one knows your story. The prospect of a new beginning, far from the shadows of the past, finally lit a small flame of hope in my heart. It was frightening, yes, but also liberating. The next morning, we started packing the little we had managed to save from our house. As we folded clothes and sorted the few objects of sentimental value, Clara, who had been strangely quiet, finally spoke. I still don't understand why Dad did that to you, Abigail. The room fell silent. How do you explain to a 1-2-year-old girl the evil that exists in the world? How do you make her understand something that even I didn't fully comprehend? Some people, even those who seem good on the outside, have darkness inside them, Mom replied, saving me from having to find the words. Your father, he was not the man he pretended to be all these years. But what about now? Is he never coming back? Clara asked, her voice small and fragile. I don't know, my daughter, Mom answered honestly. But for now, we have to think about building a new life for ourselves. 3 days later, we left for Pittsburgh on an interstate bus. We each carried only 2 suitcases, containing everything that was left of our previous lives. Looking out the window as the bus left Harmony Creek, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. I was leaving behind the scene of my worst nightmare, but also the only home I had ever known. It's a strange feeling, my dears, like escaping a house fire. You're grateful to be out of the flames, but a part of you still mourns the home that's burning. That little town held all my pain, but it also held every happy memory from before the storm. Leaving felt like saying goodbye to both the monster and the little girl he destroyed. Leaving home is never an easy choice, even when that home is filled with painful memories. The journey to Pittsburgh was an escape, but it was also a journey of self-discovery. In a strange city, could Abigail truly wash away the past, and could she ever open her heart to trust and love again? Let's follow her on this difficult yet promising journey of rebirth. The journey was long and silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened and imagine what the future held for us. For me, at 17, it was as if I was being born again, frightening but also full of possibilities. Pittsburgh welcomed us with the anonymity we so desperately needed. It was a growing city, full of people from all corners of the country seeking new opportunities. Sarah's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest but well-kept building near the downtown area. It had only 2 bedrooms, so Clara and I shared one while Mom slept with Sarah. The first few months were a period of adjustment. Mom got the job at the textile mill that Sarah had mentioned. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but she seemed to find a strange satisfaction in earning her own money for the first time in her life. Clara was enrolled in a nearby school and, after some initial resistance, started making friends. I, following Sarah's advice, enrolled to finish high school at a state school. But the transition was not easy. At night, the nightmares still haunted me. During the day, any man who vaguely resembled my father or Father Thomas would make me freeze with fear. At school, I had trouble concentrating, and my new English teacher, a middle-aged woman named Miss Fronin Davis, often caught me staring out the window, lost in dark thoughts. It was Miss Davis who, noticing my silent struggle, referred me to the school psychologist, Dr. Jacobs. I initially resisted the idea of telling my story to yet another person, but Miss Davis insisted. "Some wounds need air to heal," she said gently. Reluctantly, I began weekly sessions with Dr. Jacobs, a woman in her 42nd with kind eyes and a calm voice. At first, I could barely speak about what had happened. The words would get stuck in my throat, and I would spend most of the session in silence, staring at my hands. But Dr. Jacobs was patient. "There's no rush," she would say. "I'll be here when you're ready." It was during the 6th session that something broke inside me. A simple question. "How are you feeling today, Abigail?" And suddenly the words began to pour out, along with tears I didn't even know I still had left to cry. I told her everything, every sordid detail, every night of terror, every feeling of helplessness and shame. When I finished, exhausted and with a sore throat from crying so much, Dr. Jacobs simply said, "Abigail, you are the bravest person I have ever met." Those words, so simple yet so profound, planted the first real seed of healing in my heart. If this woman, who heard difficult stories every day, thought I was brave, maybe there was something of value in me after all. The sessions with Dr. Jacobs continued, becoming a safe harbor in my new life. Slowly, I began to process the trauma, to understand that what happened was not my fault, that I had nothing to be ashamed of. Meanwhile, life in Pittsburgh went on. Sarah introduced us to some of her friends, and we began to build a small support network. Mom, for the first time in her life, was making her own choices, discovering who she was outside of my father's domineering shadow. It was at one of these small social gatherings, a barbecue in the backyard of one of Sarah's co-workers, that I met Walter. He was a few years older than me, an engineering student at the local university, with a shy smile and eyes that seemed to see through the masks we all wear. Our first meeting was brief, just a casual conversation as we served our plates, but there was something about him, a kindness without demands, that intrigued me. When he asked if he could see me again, I was surprised at myself for saying yes. Our first date was a walk in the city park, followed by coffee at an unpretentious diner. We talked about books, movies, dreams for the future light, safe topics, but there were moments when our eyes met, and I felt he sensed there was more to my story than I was sharing. It was on the third date that I finally told him. We were sitting on a park bench watching the sunset when I suddenly felt the need to be honest. If this budding relationship was going anywhere, he needed to know who I was, what I had been through. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice trembling. "Something about my past." Walter listened in silence as I recounted, in a summarized but honest way, what had happened in Harmony Creek. I didn't go into graphic detail, but I didn't omit the essence of the truth. When I finished, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I stared at my own hands, twisted in my lap, expecting the silence to stretch until it broke our fragile connection. I braced myself for pity, for disgust, or worse, for him to get up and walk away. A full minute passed, and it felt like an eternity. Then, instead of recoiling, he gently took one of my trembling hands in both of his. He didn't say anything at first, just held it, warming my ice-cold fingers. "Thank you for telling me," he finally said, his voice soft but steady. "I can't imagine the strength it took to carry that alone. That wasn't your shame, Abigail. It was theirs, all of it." At that moment, something changed between us. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. There were no grandiose promises, just a mutual understanding, a respect that would form the basis of everything that came after. Our relationship progressed slowly, at my pace. Walter never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give. With patience and kindness, he showed me that not all men were like my father or Father Thomas, that touch could be an expression of genuine affection, not of power or domination. Meanwhile, a chapter of the past finally closed. Almost a year after our escape from Harmony Creek, we received the news. My father had been found in a small town in upstate New York, living under a false name. He was arrested and brought to trial. I was called to testify again, this time in a formal courtroom. It was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, being in the same room with him again, feeling his hateful gaze as I told my story one more time. But this time I was not alone. Mom, Sarah, Clara, and, to my surprise and gratitude, Walter were there, sitting in the front row, giving me the strength I needed. The trial lasted a week. In the end, the justice I had barely dared to hope for finally came. My father was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison. As for Father Thomas, he had already been expelled from the church after the tribunal and was now awaiting his own criminal trial. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't the end of my healing journey. That, I knew, would take much longer, but it was a significant milestone. The truth had prevailed. I had been heard, believed, validated. Back in Pittsburgh, with the shadow of the trial finally behind us, life began to take on a new rhythm. I finished high school, and encouraged by Walter and Dr. Jacobs, I applied for the entrance exam at the University of Pittsburgh, dreaming of becoming a teacher. To my surprise and joy, I was accepted. And so, at 19, I began a new phase of my life, no longer defined by the trauma I had suffered, but by the choices I was making, by the dreams I was pursuing. Walter was by my side every step of the way, his constant love and support like a rock in the midst of turmoil. When I graduated 4 years later, he was the one in the front row, cheering louder than anyone. And it was after the graduation ceremony, under the same starry Pittsburgh sky that had watched us fall in love, that he knelt and asked for my hand in marriage. I said yes, of course, not because I needed a man to complete or protect me, but because we had built something beautiful together, a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and true love. We married in a simple ceremony, with only family and close friends. It wasn't in a church. I could never again enter one without feeling chills, but in a flower-filled garden, under the golden light of the setting sun. Mom cried throughout the ceremony, but they were tears of joy. Sarah was my maid of honor. Clara, now a teenager, helped organize everything. Even Andrew came, bringing his wife and young children. The life Walter and I built together was not perfect. No life is. But it was ours, built on solid foundations of honesty, respect, and love. I'd be lying if I said the past never cast a shadow. Even years into our happy marriage, a church bell ringing unexpectedly, or the smell of old wax and incense from a candle shop, could send a jolt of ice through my veins. There was one evening, I remember, when a man who looked vaguely like Father Thomas sat near us at a restaurant. I couldn't breathe. My hands started shaking. Without a word, Walter simply paid the bill, wrapped an arm around me, and walked me out into the cool night air until my heart stopped pounding. He never made me feel foolish for it. He understood that healing wasn't about erasing the scars, but about learning to live with them without letting them win. We had 3 wonderful children, and as I raised them, I promised myself that they would never know the kind of fear that had defined my own childhood. When Walter received a job offer in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a few years later, we decided to accept the move. It was a professional opportunity for him and for me, a chance to finally leave the past behind completely, starting in a place where no one knew our story. Harrisburg became our home, the place where we raised our children, where we built our lives. And this is where I am now, at 72, telling this story, no longer as a victim, but as a survivor who found, despite everything, a path to healing and happiness. On Wednesdays, I host a group of ladies from the church for our afternoon tea and prayers. They are my longtime friends. We share not only cake recipes, they all say I make the best choufle pie in Harrisburg, but also the joys and sorrows of life. We talk about our children, our grandchildren, the aches that age brings, but also the profound blessings of each new day. It is a moment of deep connection, a reminder that we are not alone on this journey. My faith, which was so deeply shaken in my youth, found a new path over the years. I can't enter churches. The memories are still too painful. But I found God in the little things, in the smiles of my grandchildren, in the love of my husband, in the kindness of friends, in the beauty of a sunset. It is a simpler faith, perhaps, but also more authentic and personal. Walter has always respected this aspect of my life. He goes to Mass on Sundays, but he never pressured me to accompany him. Instead, we created our own sacred rituals, a prayer of gratitude before meals, a moment of contemplative silence at the end of the day, a conversation about the blessings received while we watch the stars from our porch. Sundays are special days for us. It's when the family gathers for lunch. Not everyone can always come, of course. Each has their own life now, but we make a point of keeping this tradition alive. The table is spread with an embroidered tablecloth I received from my mother, the dishes I bought one by one over the years, and the food I prepare with love from early in the morning. Seeing my children and grandchildren gathered, talking, laughing, sometimes even arguing, because that's what families do, fills me with a joy I can't explain. I look at them and think about everything I went through, how I got here, and I feel a deep gratitude for having found the strength to break that cycle of abuse and build something completely different for my own family. Not everything is rosy, of course. Age brings its limitations and its losses. Many dear friends are already gone. Mom passed away 15 years ago, peacefully, surrounded by us. Sarah, my sister, who was so fundamental in my life, passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that will never be filled. Clara lives in Erie. We don't see each other as often as I'd like, but we talk on the phone every week. As for my father and Father Thomas, I haven't had news of them for many years. After serving his sentence, my father completely disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if he is still alive, if he ever felt remorse for what he did, but I don't allow those thoughts to take up much space in my mind. I learned that forgiving does not mean forgetting or minimizing the harm that was done, but rather freeing myself from the power that harm had over me. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see a 72-year-old woman with white hair and a face marked by time. But I also see the eyes of a survivor, of someone who knew the worst of humanity and still managed to believe in the best. I see someone who transformed pain into strength, fear into courage, trauma into wisdom. This is me, Abigail Rose Miller. I am not just the girl who suffered abuse in the Church of Harmony Creek. I am a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend, a retired teacher. I am the lady who makes the best choufle pie in Harrisburg, according to my Wednesday tea friends. I am the grandma who tells stories to her grandchildren, the neighbor who always has a listening ear and gentle advice. I am so much more than my trauma, and perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. My dears who have accompanied me this far, sharing this story was not easy. For many years I carried this secret like a burden too heavy to share. But today, with the wisdom that only the years can bring, I understand that our silence only protects the abusers. It is our voices, even trembling, that have the power to change lives. If you are going through something similar to what I lived, or know someone in that situation, I want you to know you are not alone. The path to healing can be long and difficult, but it is possible. I learned that age does not define our strength, but our ability to start over each day. Even when we think there is no more hope, that we are completely broken, we can find strengths we didn't even know we had. My wrinkles are maps of survival. Each one tells a story of overcome pain. Looking back, I see that my story is not about what was done to me, but about how I chose to respond. I discovered that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take it anymore. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. If there is one thing I have learned in my 72 years of life, It is that our story does not end in the painful chapters. No matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. No matter how deep the pit we find ourselves in, there is always a way out. Sometimes, we just need an outstretched hand to help us find it. I know my little town of Harmony Creek isn't unique. I imagine there are countless other towns just like it, all over the world, where secrets are kept behind closed doors and respectable masks. There are other girls and boys suffering in silence just as I did, believing they have no voice, that no one will believe them. If my story reaches one of you, please hear this. You are not alone, and you are not to blame. Please, find one person to trust. A teacher, a neighbor, a friend. Don't carry this burden alone for as long as I did. I learned that surviving is its own form of resistance, but living well, truly well, is the best revenge. Every genuine smile I share with my Walter, every story I read to my grandchildren, every beautiful thing I crochet with my own 2 hands, each one is a victory against the men who tried to destroy me. They don't get to steal your future. And if you are someone who suspects something is wrong, please, don't look away. Don't do what so many in my town did, ignoring the signs, because it was easier than getting involved. A kind question, a moment of concern, an offer of help, it can be the single thread that helps someone pull themselves out of the darkness. Your attention could be the difference between a life of silent suffering and a chance for healing. It could be the difference that saves a life. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel to listen to other true stories from this life. May God bless your family,